Welcome to a journey through one of the most disturbing and forgotten cases in American history. Today, we venture into the mist-shrouded shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where three sisters became the stuff of horror legends that history has tried to erase. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Does anyone here live near those haunting mountains where it all began? It was the year 1873. The United States was still reeling from the wounds of the Civil War, which had ended just 8 years earlier. The South lay in ruins, families shattered and destitute. In the remote mountain regions of West Virginia and Kentucky, the law existed only as a distant rumor. Among the fog-covered ridges where peaks vanished into low clouds and valleys held ancient secrets, a tale was born, one that still makes locals lower their voices when spoken of. The Appalachian Mountains have long carried a reputation for mystery and dread. Since the first settlers arrived, these dense forests have hidden strange happenings. Disappearing trails, travelers who entered and never returned, eerie sounds echoing through the pines at night. Yet nothing compared to the horror that would unfold on a small, isolated property in Pike County, Kentucky, near the West Virginia border. The Whitlock family had lived there for generations, rugged mountain folk hardened by isolation and labor. The father, Jonathan Whitlock, returned from the war missing one arm and carrying a bitterness deeper than his scars. His wife, Sarah, had died giving birth to triplet daughters in 1852, Martha, Clara, and June. 21 years later, those girls would become something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Growing up motherless in the mountains was hard enough. Growing up with a violent, drunken father was hell. Their nearest neighbors, the Carpenters, lived 3 miles away along a treacherous trail. There was no school, no church, nothing but cliffs, forest, and the mournful wind that howled through the canyons. The sisters grew up wild, learning to hunt, to trap, and to survive. Jonathan rarely went down to Pikeville, the county seat. When he did, he returned drunk, furious, and broke, his temper as sharp as the blade he often carried. The sisters learned to hide when they heard his heavy boots on the trail. They learned to stay silent, never cry, and never resist. But they also learned something darker, that in these mountains, far from any law, a person could do anything and face no consequences. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came in May of 1873. A traveling merchant named Elias Turner, known and liked in the region, passed through the Whitlock property selling tools, cloth, and medicine. Such visits were common. Mountain folk relied on peddlers for supplies and news from the outside world. But Elias never returned home. His wife waited a week before alerting the Floyd County Sheriff. A search was launched, but finding someone in the Appalachians was like looking for a needle in a haystack that stretched across an entire state. Trails split and vanished. Ravines swallowed footprints, and the forest was so dense that a man could vanish within feet of another. Sheriff Thomas Blackburn, a seasoned war veteran and skilled tracker, followed Elias's familiar route. Locals confirmed his last known stop was near the Whitlock property. It was supposed to be his final visit before heading home. On a rainy June afternoon, Sheriff Blackburn and 3 deputies climbed up to the Whitlock cabin. Jonathan met them on the porch, clearly intoxicated despite the early hour. He denied ever seeing the merchant, claiming no one had visited in weeks. The 3 daughters stood silently in the doorway, identical and eerily still. They didn't blink. They didn't move. Their clothes were filthy, their hair wild, and their eyes cold as stone. Something about them made the sheriff's skin crawl. When Blackburn requested to search the property, Jonathan refused, citing his rights. He was correct. Without a warrant, the sheriff had no authority to enter. So Blackburn noted everything in his ledger and left, but unease gnawed at him. 3 weeks later, another man vanished, a traveling preacher named Reverend Isaiah Morton. Known for his kindness and frail health, the Reverend often relied on the generosity of mountain families. Witnesses confirmed he too had been heading toward the higher mountains, planning to visit the Whitlock property before continuing his route. The preacher's disappearance caused an uproar. He was beloved, and churches across 3 counties joined forces to search for him. For days, men scoured ravines, caves, and forest trails, but they found nothing. It was as though the mountains themselves had swallowed him. Sheriff Blackburn returned, this time with 5 deputies and a search warrant issued by a county judge. Jonathan raged, calling it persecution and demanding respect as a war veteran, but the sheriff stood firm. They searched the cabin, 3 small, poorly built rooms, and the barn, which contained only rusted tools and old hay. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the sheriff couldn't shake a sick feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air itself felt heavy, tainted with a faint, nauseating odor he couldn't identify. That summer, 3 more people disappeared: a young fur trapper named William Hayes, a traveling doctor named Samuel Pritchard, and a woman named Rebecca Stone, who was fleeing an arranged marriage. Each vanished after being seen heading toward the Whitlock property. No trace of them was ever found. No clothing, no tools, no remains. Fear spread through the counties. Newspapers called the area the Valley of Death. Some whispered about vengeful ghosts of soldiers, others about ancient curses or creatures lurking in the caves. The Appalachians had always inspired superstition, but now the line between legend and reality was blurring. Sheriff Blackburn's frustration grew. His reputation was at stake, and despite his experience tracking deserters and outlaws, he faced a mystery with no clues, just vanishing souls. In August, he made a risky choice. He assembled a group of trusted men and stationed them secretly around the Whitlock property to watch day and night. It wasn't exactly legal, but it wasn't exactly forbidden either. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Jonathan came and went, always drunk. The sisters appeared rarely, usually to fetch water or hunt. Observers reported that they moved with uncanny grace and silence, like predators born of the forest. Then, one September afternoon, everything changed. A lone traveler appeared on the mountain trail, a middle-aged man neatly dressed and riding a bay horse. His saddlebags were full and a rifle hung at his side. The hidden watchmen saw him pass and head straight toward the Whitlock cabin. They wanted to warn him, but doing so would have revealed their surveillance. They could only watch as he disappeared into the fog, toward the place where so many before him had vanished without a trace. They could only watch helplessly as the man guided his horse up the steep, winding path until both vanished into the dense trees. 2 hours later, the horse returned down the trail alone, its saddle empty, reins dragging, and saddlebags gone. The animal was trembling, neighing nervously, its ears twitching backward as if it had witnessed something unspeakable. The watchman managed to capture it and brought it straight to Sheriff Blackburn's camp. The sheriff didn't hesitate. He gathered 12 armed deputies and led them up the mountain toward the Whitlock property. This time there would be no polite conversation, no waiting for warrants, only answers. Dusk was settling as they arrived, the sun bleeding red across the peaks. The cabin stood silent. Thin smoke rose from the chimney, proof that someone was home, yet there was no movement, no sound, only an oppressive stillness that seemed to choke the air. Blackburn knocked hard on the door. No response. He struck again, announcing his authority, but the silence continued. With a gesture, he ordered 2 men to break it down. The door gave way easily. It hadn't even been latched. The deputies entered with rifles raised, prepared for violence. Instead, they found a scene that was far more disturbing in its calmness. Jonathan Whitlock sat at the table, a half-empty whiskey bottle beside him. He was dead. His skin was cold, his eyes open and glassy, staring into nothing. There were no wounds, no blood. He appeared to have simply stopped living. In the next room, the 3 sisters sat on the floor, hands clasped in a circle, swaying gently as they sang a slow, haunting melody in low voices. None of the men recognized the tune. They did not look up when the lawman entered. They did not stop singing. It was as though they were lost in some other world. A chill ran through Sheriff Blackburn. The air in the cabin was heavy, almost unbreathable, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move. Then came the smell, faint but unmistakable. Decay. Something was rotting. One of the deputies, Henry Walsh, a man hardened by war and death, began to search for the source. At the rear of the cabin, partly hidden beneath straw and old boards, he found a trapdoor, one that had gone unnoticed in previous searches. He called to the sheriff. Blackburn gave a grim nod and the men lifted the door. What they saw beneath it would haunt them forever. Below was not a basement, but a natural cavity in the rock, a shallow cave built into the mountain itself. The damp air wafting up was thick with the smell of earth and something else, something foul. Inside lay the belongings of at least 10 people, Neatly folded clothes, boots of different sizes, saddlebags still filled with provisions, a Bible, with Reverend Isaiah Morton engraved on the cover, a merchant's tools, a doctor's instruments, and a woman's torn dress that could only have belonged to Rebecca Stone. Each item was a silent testament to a life that had vanished. And yet, no bodies. The deputies climbed down into the darkness with lanterns. The chamber stretched about 5 meters wide and 8 meters long, barely high enough to stand upright in the center. The limestone walls were damp and etched with strange, undecipherable markings, symbols that looked carved, scratched, or perhaps clawed. Up above, the sisters kept singing. When 2 deputies moved to restrain them, the song stopped. In perfect synchronization, all 3 turned their heads toward the men. Their eyes, reflecting the dim lamplight, appeared completely black. One of them, no one could tell which, smiled. It was not a human smile. It was feral, sharp, and devoid of emotion. The men chained the sisters' wrists and ankles, but even bound, they moved together, breathing, turning, blinking as one. None spoke a word. The search continued through the night. More deputies arrived from Pikeville with hounds trained for tracking. The dogs became restless near the trapdoor, barking and whining. One bloodhound refused to go near it at all. It lay on the ground and began to howl, a long, mournful cry that echoed through the mountains. At dawn, under the cold gray light of morning, the men made another discovery behind the barn. In a clearing hidden by thick brush, they found the remains of numerous old fires. Charred circles of stone dotted the ground, and among them lay fragments of bone, too small and burnt to identify, yet unmistakably human. One deputy vomited. Another began praying. Sheriff Blackburn, whose hands had not shaken even in battle, felt them tremble as he wrote his notes. He had seen death before, but nothing like this. This was not merely murder, it was something older, darker, and far beyond reason. The sisters were loaded onto a cart borrowed from a nearby farm. Blackburn ordered that they be kept apart, Martha in front, Clara in the middle, June in back. Yet even separated, they moved as one. When one turned her head, the others followed. When one blinked, all blinked. It was as if 3 bodies shared a single will. The men guarding them avoided eye contact. There was something about those young women that defied comprehension, that stirred a deep, instinctive terror. The journey down the mountain was long and treacherous. The cart creaked along narrow paths, swaying dangerously on steep inclines. The sisters showed no emotion, no fear, no fatigue. They did not speak, drink, or even glance at one another, only stared ahead with that eerie calm. By the time they reached Pikeville, the afternoon sun hung low. Word had already spread. Nearly 200 townspeople crowded the main street, relatives of the missing furious locals and those hungry for vengeance. The air buzzed with shouts and hatred. The sheriff's men had to form a barrier around the cart to keep the mob back. Some demanded immediate execution, others screamed for answers. But the sisters sat in absolute stillness, pale and expressionless, untouched by the chaos around them, as if the world's noise no longer reached them. The jail in Pikeville was small, a simple stone and wood structure with 4 narrow cells. Blackburn ordered the sisters separated, hoping to break their uncanny bond. The moment the deputies began pulling them apart, the women erupted. Their mouths opened in perfect unison, releasing not words but shrill, piercing sounds that made hardened men clutch their ears. 3 voices, 1 tone. A single sustained note of inhuman resonance that filled the air for half a minute before cutting off abruptly. Afterward, the sisters went to their cells without resistance. Separated for the first time, they became utterly still. Each retreated to a corner facing the wall. They did not sit or lie down, they simply stood motionless, eyes open, unblinking. The guards could not tell whether they were awake or asleep. Their breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. That night, strange things began to happen. 2 experienced guards, Robert Mills and James Crawford, were assigned to watch them. Around 11, Mills heard faint whispers echoing from the cells, low, rhythmic murmurs that seemed to come from all 3 at once. When he stepped closer, the sound ceased instantly. The sisters hadn't moved. At 2 in the morning, Crawford swore he saw one of them, he couldn't tell which, floating several inches above the floor. He called for Mills, but when they looked again, she stood normally, staring at the wall. The two men exchanged uneasy glances, saying nothing but both knowing they'd felt it, an unseen force pressing down on the building, as though the walls themselves had absorbed some lingering evil. When dawn came and Sheriff Blackburn arrived, he found his guards pale, shaking, and drenched in sweat. Drenched. Both begged to be relieved of duty. The sheriff didn't argue. He understood. He himself felt the oppressive weight in the air as he stepped into the narrow corridor where the sisters were being held. Meanwhile, the investigation at the Whitlock estate pressed on. Additional men had been dispatched, along with the county's medical examiner, Dr. Albert Brennan. Jonathan Whitlock's body was examined right there on the table where he had been found. Brennan could find no marks of violence, no signs of poison, nothing that explained the death. It appeared as though Jonathan had simply ceased living, perhaps the victim of heart failure compounded by years of drinking. Yet one detail disturbed the doctor. Jonathan's pupils were abnormally wide, dilated as though his final sight had been something unspeakably terrifying. The analysis of the bone fragments discovered near the fire pits confirmed everyone's worst fears. They were human remains, splinters of skulls, ribs, and the long bones of arms and legs. Every piece had been exposed to intense heat, burned to the point that only prolonged fires, maintained for many hours, even days, could have produced such complete reduction. It was no accident. The burning had been deliberate, methodical, ritualistic. Then came a discovery even more unsettling. Beneath a loose floorboard in the sisters' room, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, the men found a diary. It belonged to Sarah Whitlock, the mother who had died 21 years earlier during childbirth. The entries were uneven and smeared, written in a trembling hand that betrayed illness, or fear. But the contents were far beyond anything anyone had imagined. Sarah wrote of her troubled pregnancy, of nightmares that plagued her every night. 3 shadowy figures visiting her, whispering in a language she didn't know but somehow understood. She described waking to find strange scratches on her skin and a growing dread that what she carried inside her was not entirely human. The final entries, penned only days before the birth, were nearly illegible. Scrawled as if in desperation, Sarah described visions of 3 identical girls who would one day become something monstrous. She begged for God's forgiveness, though for what, she never said. One passage mentioned an ancient cave deep within the mountain, a place the Cherokee people once used for forgotten rituals. She wrote that she could feel that place calling to her, drawing her unborn children toward it. The last line of the diary stretched across the page in jagged, frantic handwriting. "They're not mine. They belong to the mountain." Sheriff Blackburn. Read those words sitting on the porch of the Whitlock cabin as the sun dipped behind the ridges. He was not a superstitious man. He'd seen too much of life's real cruelties to believe in spirits. Yet as he held that diary in his shaking hands, he couldn't ignore the chill that ran through him. There was something about that mountain. Something older than the Whitlocks, older even than the settlers, and the sisters were bound to it in ways he could not understand. Back in Pikeville, preparations for the trial were underway. The county prosecutor, Nathaniel Pierce, began assembling the case. It was legally complex. They had ample circumstantial evidence, the victim's belongings, the bone fragments, the pattern of disappearances, but no bodies, no witnesses, and no confessions. The sisters remained mute. Pierce enlisted help from Lexington, an experienced prosecutor familiar with homicide cases, and a psychiatrist, Dr. Heinrich Meller, a German immigrant educated in Europe, who was brought in to examine the sisters. Dr. Muller spent 3 days observing them through the iron bars. His report was deeply unsettling. The sisters, he wrote, did not exhibit ordinary human consciousness. They showed no emotion, no fear, anger, or sadness, and barely acknowledged external stimuli. It was as though their perception existed on a different plane, detached from the shared reality of others. Even separated in cells where they could not see each other, Their actions remained synchronized. When one moved, the others followed. Seconds later, when one began to eat, the others mirrored the motion exactly. It was, Mueller noted, an impossibility under known natural law. He speculated cautiously that they might be suffering from a rare psychiatric phenomenon known as folie à trois, a shared psychosis among close individuals, but he admitted that the theory failed to account for what he had witnessed. The case soon drew national attention. Newspapers from Louisville, Cincinnati, and even New York sent correspondents to cover what they called the devilish triplets of Appalachia. Sensational reports blurred fact and fiction. Some claimed witchcraft, others suggested possession, and still others whispered of inhuman ancestry, the result of deranged colonial experiments lost to time. The trial was set for October 15, 1873. The Pike County Courthouse, a modest hall that could seat 50, was surrounded by hundreds eager to witness history. Presiding over the proceedings was Judge Cornelius Hammond, 62 years old and 20 years on the bench, yet he had never faced a case like this. The sisters arrived in chains, dressed in plain garments provided by the sheriff's wife. Even in these simple clothes, there was something untamed about them. Their hair, though combed, soon fell into disarray, and their pale faces remained mask-like, devoid of expression. They moved together, their chains clinking in eerie harmony, three bodies guided by one unseen rhythm. Prosecutor Pierce methodically presented his case. One by one, witnesses testified, families of the missing identifying the personal belongings found in the Whitlock cellar. Elias Turner's widow broke down as she recognized her husband's patched coat. Reverend Morton's children confirmed the engraved Bible. Rebecca Stone's sister identified the embroidered hem of her missing sister's dress. Dr. Brennan described the condition of the bone fragments and the deliberate fires that had consumed them. He testified that the fragments represented at least 8 individuals. The jurors paled, one nearly fainted. Dr. Mueller followed, recounting his clinical observations of the sisters, his tone calm and scientific, yet every word deepened the horror in the room. Through it all, the sisters sat motionless, their gazes fixed ahead. They did not flinch when the victim's belongings were displayed, nor did they react to the cries of the grieving. It was as though they existed in another world entirely, one untouched by human grief or guilt. Their defense was led by a young court-appointed lawyer, Thomas Aldridge, barely 3 years out of law school. It was a hopeless task, and he knew it. His clients refused to speak, offering no cooperation or explanation. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that hysteria had clouded reason, and that without bodies there could be no proof of murder. But even he could sense the futility in his words. Everyone in that courtroom had already decided the sisters were guilty, not just legally, but in some primal, unspoken way. They represented a darkness civilization had long tried to bury. Then on the third day of the trial, something happened that silenced the entire room. One of the sisters, Martha, identified by a small scar on her left hand, turned her head and looked directly at the jurors. It was the first deliberate act any of them had made since their arrest. Her gaze moved slowly from face to face, pausing on each man for several seconds. There was no anger in her eyes, no plea, no fear, only a calm, cold scrutiny, as though she were the one passing judgment on them. Like a predator studying its prey, Martha's gaze lingered on each juror until several of them, unable to withstand it, turned their eyes away. Among them was Jacob Miller, a broad-shouldered farmer known throughout Pike County for his fearlessness. Yet even he blanched. Later, he would confess that when Martha looked at him, it felt as though she could see straight through his flesh, into his thoughts, his memories, down to the very essence of his soul. When she had finished studying the jurors one by one, Martha turned her eyes toward Judge Hammond. For a long, tense moment, the two locked gazes across the hushed courtroom. The judge, a man of steadfast law and firm faith, refused to look away. But even he felt something ancient and alien in those eyes, an intelligence that had no place in the mind of a 21-year-old woman raised in isolation. Then Martha smiled. It was only a faint curve of her lips, but it changed her face entirely. There was no warmth in it, no hint of mockery or amusement. It was the cold satisfaction of something inevitable, the look of a plan meeting its destined end. Then, in a voice as soft and melodious as it was chilling, she spoke for the first time since her arrest. Her words were clear, unshaken, and stripped of any regional accent. "You can't kill the mountain." 6 words, nothing more. After speaking, she turned her head forward again and fell silent, returning to that same eerie stillness that had defined her since capture. Yet those 6 words lingered in the air like a poisonous vapor. Whispers spread through the courtroom, rising like a restless wind. Judge Hammond struck his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but the damage was done. Everyone had heard her, and no one could escape the weight of what those words might mean. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. 11 murders, each tied to a disappearance that could be traced back to the Whitlocks. Judge Hammond set sentencing for the following week. In Pike County, there was only one punishment for such crimes: death by hanging. News spread fast. By the next day, Pikeville was overflowing. People arrived from neighboring counties, some seeking justice, others drawn by a morbid curiosity to witness the spectacle. Vendors lined the streets selling food and drink, and what should have been a solemn occasion took on the air of a carnival. The sight unsettled Sheriff Blackburn deeply. He doubled the guard that night, stationing 6 armed men inside the jail. The saloons were overflowing, the crowd restless, and he feared mob violence more than ever. He would not allow a lynching, no matter how hated the condemned were. Around midnight, the guards began hearing voices. At first, it sounded like chanting from within the jail, but soon it was clear the sounds were not coming from the sisters. There were many voices, dozens of them, echoing through the corridors as though rising from deep underground. The language was unlike any they knew, harsh, guttural, filled with rhythms that seemed to claw at the ears. None of the men could identify it. One guard, young Peter Sullivan, swore he saw shadows on the walls shifting and stretching, moving in ways that defied the light of their lanterns. He described figures, human shapes, but warped, fluid, sliding across stone as if alive. Another, Matthew Price, reported a sudden, unnatural cold. His breath turned white before him, frost forming on the iron bars, though outside the autumn air remained mild. At exactly 3 o'clock, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The guards approached the cells. The sisters stood in their usual positions, motionless, facing the walls. But something had changed. Etched into the stone were intricate symbols, fresh carvings that no one had seen before. The markings glimmered faintly in the lantern light, forming complex geometric patterns that seemed to ripple and shift if stared at too long. Sheriff Blackburn was summoned at once. When he arrived and saw them, a deep primal dread welled up inside him. They were only scratches, and yet they radiated a wrongness that pierced straight into the instinctive part of the human mind, the part that remembers fear of the dark. He ordered the walls to be scrubbed clean, but when the men tried, they discovered that the carvings had been cut deep into the stone, far deeper than fingernails or shackles could have reached. To create such marks would have required hours of labor with proper tools, and yet no one had heard a sound. Dawn broke on October 23, 1873, under a shroud of gray. Thick fog covered Pikeville, dulling all color and sound. The crowd, swollen overnight, now stood in tense silence before the jail, their faces ghostly in the mist. The scaffold rose behind the building, 3 ropes swaying gently in the damp air. 3 ropes for 3 murderers. The executioner, a man brought in from another county, worked with methodical precision, testing knots, adjusting heights, ensuring the drops would be swift and final. At 8:30, the Whitlock sisters were led out. The crowd fell utterly silent. Even in chains, the 3 commanded attention, not with beauty, but with presence, as though something immense and unseen stood behind them. They walked in perfect unison, steps measured, eyes forward, faces unreadable. The priest stepped forward to offer their final rites, but they did not respond. It was as if his words existed in a different reality altogether. The women mounted the scaffold together, climbing each step as though moved by one will. The executioner adjusted the ropes around their necks, his assistant lifting the black hoods. When he tried to place one over Martha's head, she turned toward him. Her calm, unwavering stare made him falter. The hood slipped from his shaking hands as he mumbled a prayer and stepped back. The executioner hesitated only a moment before deciding to proceed without the hoods. Let the crowd see their faces, he thought. Judge Hammond stepped forward and read the sentence aloud, his voice carrying strangely through the fog. He declared Martha, Clara, and June Whitlock guilty of heinous crimes and sentenced them to death. He asked if they had any final words. For a long time there was nothing. Then together the three opened their mouths and spoke in perfect unison. The mountain remembers. The mountain awaits. The mountain always returns. They repeated the phrase 3 times, their voices overlapping in a haunting harmony that seemed to vibrate in the bones of everyone who heard it. Then silence. The executioner looked to the judge. Hammond gave a solemn nod. The lever was pulled. The trapdoors fell open and the 3 bodies dropped as one. The ropes snapped taut with a sickening crack, but death did not come swiftly. The sisters writhed, legs kicking, bodies jerking in perfect synchronization. Every motion mirrored as if one soul still moved them all. The crowd recoiled. Some wept, others prayed. At last the movement ceased. The 3 hung still, swaying lightly in the damp air. The doctor waited the required 5 minutes before checking each pulse. No heartbeat. The Whitlock sisters were dead. But as the doctor announced the time of death, the fog began to stir. It twisted in slow, deliberate spirals around the scaffold. The air grew colder, unnaturally so. Breath turned visible. Frost clung to the wood. Then came a deep rumble from the mountains, low and resonant, shaking the ground beneath their feet. It was not thunder, not wind, not any sound of the natural world. It felt alive. Birds burst from the trees in chaotic flocks. Dogs howled in every direction. Horses panicked, rearing and breaking free from their tethers, galloping blindly through the streets. The crowd fled in terror, scattering into homes and taverns. And through it all, Sheriff Blackburn and Judge Hammond stood their ground, fighting to keep their composure, though both knew in their hearts that something had awakened and that Pikeville would never be the same again. They watched in silence as the lifeless bodies were lowered and placed into 3 plain pine coffins that had been prepared earlier that morning. The gravediggers, 2 brothers, Samuel and Daniel Foster, loaded the coffins onto a wagon for transport to the city cemetery. The burial was to take place in the section reserved for criminals, far from the resting places of the town's respectable dead. But when the brothers tried to urge the horses forward, the animals refused to move. These were strong, obedient workhorses used to hauling far heavier loads, yet now they stood rigid, hooves dug into the mud, eyes wide with terror. No amount of shouting or coaxing could persuade them. Even when they were replaced with a fresh pair, the result was the same. Not a single horse would approach the wagon carrying the Whitlock sisters. In the end, 10 men had to push and pull the cart themselves along the dirt road toward the cemetery. The effort was slow and punishing, and as they worked, the sky above Pikeville darkened. Heavy clouds gathered with unnatural speed, smothering the daylight. Distant flashes of lightning tore across the horizon, though no thunder followed. It was as if the heavens themselves looked down in judgment upon what mankind had done. At the cemetery, 3 open graves waited in the unconsecrated ground, a neglected corner of the burial field reserved for the condemned. When the first coffin was lowered, one of the ropes snapped, sending the box crashing into the pit with a hollow thud that made several men flinch. Stronger ropes were fetched, but they too broke. First with the second coffin, then with the third. It was as though even the tools of the living rejected the task. At last, the men used wooden planks and brute force to lower the coffins into their graves. The priest, pale and shaken, refused to perform the final rites. He declared that these women had served darkness and did not deserve holy words to accompany them into the earth. A few protested quietly, but most were relieved to be done. The gravediggers began to shovel dirt onto the coffins. Then the storm broke. It came all at once, a deluge so fierce it seemed the sky itself had split open. Sheets of rain poured down, blinding and relentless, while winds howled through the cemetery, bending trees and tearing shingles from nearby roofs. Lightning struck the ground in rapid succession, each bolt followed instantly by thunder that rattled the bones. The storm lasted barely 20 minutes, yet when it passed, it left Pikeville in ruin. The men stood drenched and trembling, surrounded by flooding graves. The pits had filled with filthy, swirling water. They waited hours for it to drain enough to finish their work, shoveling mud until dusk fell. None of them wanted to remain there after dark. They hurriedly piled earth over the coffins without ceremony, leaving the graves unmarked. No tombstones were erected, just 3 uneven mounds of raw earth that the weeds would soon reclaim. The town wanted to forget, to erase the Whitlock name from its memory. But memories are stubborn things. In the days and weeks that followed, Pikeville was anything but at peace. It began with dreams. Dozens of townspeople reported the same nightmares, 3 shadowed figures standing in the mountains calling to them, always calling. Some dreamed of glowing symbols carved into stone, others of voices chanting in forgotten tongues that scraped against the mind like knives. Sheriff Blackburn was among the afflicted. Every night at precisely 3 in the morning, the hour the chanting had ceased in the jail, he woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, gripped by the unshakable certainty that someone was standing in the darkness of his room. His wife said he had stopped looking toward the northern mountains altogether. Judge Hammond developed a tremor in his hands that no doctor could explain. He tried to conceal it, but it grew worse. At night, alone in his office, he began hearing faint whispers from the corners of the room. He could never make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Mockery and the promise of something dreadful yet to come. The jurors, too, suffered. Jacob Miller, the farmer who had turned pale under Martha's stare, awoke one morning to find every animal on his property dead. 30 head of cattle, pigs, chickens, all lifeless with no sign of injury or disease. It was as if something had drained the vitality from them in silence. Another juror's house burned to the ground in the middle of the night. Another watched his crops wither and blacken overnight as though poisoned by the very soil. Then came the disappearances. They were not as frequent as before, but they were enough to rekindle old fear. A child vanished while playing near the woods. A seasoned hunter, one who knew every trail and ridge, went missing without a trace. A traveling peddler was last seen heading north toward the mountains. None returned. 6 months after the execution, in the spring of 1874, reports began reaching Sheriff Blackburn of strange lights near the old Whitlock estate. Witnesses spoke of orbs moving through the forest, lights that danced between trees, flickered in patterns, and sometimes arranged themselves into perfect circles and impossible shapes. The sheriff gathered 15 men, all armed and experienced, and set out to investigate. The journey was grueling. The trail they had once used was nearly gone, swallowed by wild growth. Roots clawed through the soil, branches blocked the way, and the forest seemed determined to reclaim what was once taken from it. It took 2 days to reach the clearing where the Whitlock cabin stood, or what was left of it. The sight made every man stop in his tracks. The cabin had aged decades in months. The wood was blackened with rot. The roof half collapsed, the windows shattered. Moss and fungus crawled over every surface. It looked less like a house than a corpse. Yet worse than the decay was the feeling that hung in the air, an invisible weight pressing down on every breath. The men felt it instantly. They were being watched. The horses grew frantic and had to be tied far from the clearing. When the men approached the door, it swung open on a single rusted hinge. Inside, the air was unnaturally cold. Lanterns revealed a scene of decay, collapsed furniture, damp floors, mold spreading like veins. But what drew every eye were the symbols. The same carvings that had once defaced the jail cells now covered the walls of the cabin, vast, intricate, endless. They coiled and spiraled across the wood, forming shapes that seemed to writhe if stared at too long. Deputy William Carter, new to Pikeville and unfamiliar with the horror of the case, laughed nervously. "Just nonsense," he said, and reached out to touch one. The moment his fingers brushed the wood, he screamed. He pulled his hand back, and the men saw a red burn seared into his palm. The wood was cold. Carter said nothing more for the rest of the expedition. They found the trapdoor still open, leading into the cavity below. The wooden stairs were rotten but intact. 3 men descended, Blackburn among them. The underground chamber was just as they had left it, except for one terrible change. In the center of the dirt floor, a new hole yawned, no more than a foot wide but impossibly deep. They dropped a stone inside and waited. It never hit bottom. From the darkness came a sound, a low, steady hum, faint but alive, vibrating through the soil. Beneath it, at intervals, there were whispers. Or singing. The same melody the guards had heard that final night in the jail. The sheriff ordered everyone out. That sound, faint as it was, stirred something primitive in them, a bone-deep instinct to flee. When they emerged into daylight, no one spoke. Together, without discussion, they agreed to seal the hole. They threw stones into it one after another, but the stones never filled it. The pit swallowed everything. In the end, they boarded it over with heavy planks and piled rocks on top. Though each man knew it was useless, As the oppressive stillness thickened around them, Blackburn gave the final order. The cabin was to be burned. Flames, he reasoned, were the only thing that might cleanse the place or at least keep others from ever stumbling upon it again. The men gathered kindling, doused the rotten wood in oil, and stepped back. As the fire caught and the structure groaned under its own collapse, no one looked away. None spoke. Each man felt in the deepest part of himself that they were not ending a curse, only closing one chapter of something ancient, something waiting to rise again from beneath the mountain. They stacked dry wood around the remains of the hut, poured the kerosene they had brought, and set it ablaze. The flames caught quickly, leaping high into the afternoon sky. The decayed wood burned with an unnatural vigor, as though eager to be consumed. But when the fire reached the walls marked with those strange symbols, something impossible occurred. The flames changed color. They flickered in hues that should not exist, deep greens and violets that seemed to pierce the eyes, blues so brilliant they felt cold rather than hot. From the rising smoke came more than the crackling of burning timber. There were voices, singing, chanting, or perhaps screaming, in languages no living soul could comprehend. The men backed away, watching in uneasy silence as the hut was devoured by fire. The blaze raged for hours, burning far longer than it should have, until nothing remained but ashes and a few blackened stones where the foundation had been. When at last the fire died, the sheriff noticed something deeply disturbing. The ashes were not ordinary. They were black as coal, yet when touched, they left no trace of soot. They were cold, lifeless, as though untouched by flame, and in several spots the ash had settled into intricate patterns, the same symbols that had once covered the cabin walls. That night, the men made camp far from the ruins of the Whitlock property. No one slept well. From the surrounding forest came eerie sounds, footsteps too heavy for any known animal, branches breaking under unseen weight, and always that faint, distant chorus rising from deep within the mountains. 3 voices, singing in perfect harmony, weaving a melody that felt older than humanity itself. At dawn, they broke camp quickly, eager to leave that cursed place behind. The descent was faster than their climb, driven by an unspoken urgency to escape the weight pressing down on them. When they finally saw Pikeville in the distance, relief washed over them like sunlight after a storm. Yet beneath that relief was a shared, silent understanding nothing had truly ended. The sisters were dead, their home destroyed, but the mountain still stood and the mountain remembered. In the years following the expedition of 1874, the tale of the Whitlock sisters passed into Appalachian folklore, whispered not as entertainment but as a warning. Locals avoided certain stretches of the northern mountains, especially the land where the Whitlock estate had once stood. Even seasoned hunters began taking long detours rather than pass near that cursed ground. Families who had lived for generations in the remote hollows packed their belongings and moved closer to the safety of towns. Sheriff Blackburn remained in Pikeville for 3 more years, though the experience had changed him forever. His hair turned white before his 50th birthday, and his hands would tremble whenever anyone spoke of the mountains. In 1877, he resigned without explanation and moved his family to Louisville, far from the haunting ridges that framed his nightmares. Those close to him said he often woke in terror at the same hour every night, his eyes wide with unspoken fear. Judge Hammond stayed behind but refused to preside over any case connected to crimes from the Highlands. His tremor worsened year by year until in 1880, he suffered what doctors called a nervous collapse. He spent his final years in a mental asylum in Lexington, endlessly sketching the same symbols on the walls, tables, and even his own skin. The attendants burned his drawings daily, but he always redrew them. When he died in 1883, his final words echoed the same phrase Martha Whitlock had spoken in court. The mountain remembers. The jurors of the original trial met similar fates. 9 of the 12 men died before reaching 60, each under strange and inexplicable circumstances. Jacob Miller, the farmer who had lost all his livestock, vanished during a storm in 1879. His body never recovered. Another juror was found dead in his bed, eyes wide open, his face frozen in terror. A third lost his sanity, claiming he was followed everywhere by 3 identical women who always stood just at the edge of his sight. Only 3 jurors lived to old age, and all 3 left Pike County never to return. When questioned years later, each refused to speak of the trial, visibly shaken at even the mention of it. Meanwhile, the cemetery where the sisters had been buried became a site of growing unease. The soil over their graves never settled, no matter how often it was leveled. Grass and weeds refused to grow there, leaving 3 barren mounds of dark, lifeless earth. Visitors reported hearing faint whispers at dusk, or seeing shifting shadows among the headstones on moonless nights. Some swore they saw 3 female figures standing together at the edge of the cemetery, identical, unmoving and gone the moment anyone drew near. In 1886, 13 years after the execution, a rare earthquake shook the region. The damage in Pikeville was minor, but in the cemetery the ground split open. The 3 Whitlock graves had collapsed inward, leaving gaping holes. When the gravedigger investigated, he found the coffins gone. No tunnels, no signs of disturbance, no trace of wood, cloth, or bone. It was as though the bodies had simply vanished or had never been buried at all. The official record attributed it to seismic activity. No search was made. The holes were filled in again, left unmarked and untouched. Still, the disappearances continued. Every few years, someone vanished in those same northern woods. Hunters, travelers, even children without a trace. The reports were quietly filed away as accidents or animal attacks, but everyone in Pikeville knew better. The truth, though never spoken aloud, was felt in the marrow of every old mountain family. The Whitlock sisters were gone, but their presence lingered. As the century turned, the story began to fade from official record. Court files were lost to accidental fires, newspapers crumbled to dust, and witnesses passed away. Yet the oral traditions endured. Around campfires and on stormy nights, the tale was told in low voices. The story of the 3 sisters, the cursed mountain, and the echo that still called from deep within the earth. By the early 20th century, progress had reached Appalachia. Railroads, roads, electricity, and telephones connected once isolated valleys. The world was growing smaller, brighter, safer, but the mountains remained ancient and unchanged. The disappearances, though rare, never truly stopped. In the 1920s, a young historian named Theodore Ashford at the University of Kentucky became fascinated by these legends. Raised on his grandmother's stories of Pikeville and the Whitlock sisters, he resolved to uncover the truth buried beneath folklore. He spent months poring over old court ledgers, forgotten archives, and yellowed newspapers. He traveled from town to town, interviewing descendants of those who had lived through the events of 1873. Piece by piece, he began to uncover fragments of a past that refused to stay buried. The records of the trial were incomplete. Fragmented documents, a few yellowed newspaper clippings, and, surprisingly, the coroner's report, which had survived the passage of time. More valuable still, Theodore Ashford managed to locate 3 elderly individuals who had been children at the time of the execution. Each one vividly recalled seeing the Whitlock sisters being led to the scaffold. Their testimonies were consistent, unsettlingly so. They all remembered the unnatural fog that rolled through the town, the strange hum echoing from the mountains, when the ropes tightened, and the overpowering sense that something vast and ancient hovered over that grim day, something far older than the 3 young women themselves. One of the witnesses, a 78-year-old woman named Elizabeth Porter, told Ashford something that haunted him for the rest of his life. They weren't the evil ones. They were just the servants. The real evil is still up there in those mountains, waiting. Always waiting. Determined to uncover the truth, Ashford decided to do what no one had dared in decades: return to the site of the old Whitlock estate. It was the summer of 1927 when he set out alone, against the stern warnings of everyone he consulted. Armed with a camera, a notebook, and camping supplies, he began his ascent into the wild heart of Appalachia. The trails had long since vanished, swallowed by the forest, so he relied on century-old maps and fragmented records to guide him. After 3 grueling days, he found the place, or what remained of it. All that was left were blackened stones, half buried in roots and vines. Trees had grown through what had once been the foundation, and thick moss blanketed the earth. The air itself felt heavy, charged with a strange energy that made his skin crawl. Ashford took photographs, measurements, and detailed notes, documenting everything with academic precision. As the sun began to sink behind the ridges, He searched for the entrance to the underground cavity rumored to exist beneath the old cabin. But as dusk fell, a primal fear gripped him, an instinctive ancient terror that defied logic. Something in his mind screamed that he had to leave. He gathered his equipment in haste and began descending the mountain, but the darkness closed in too quickly. Forced to make camp in a small clearing, he built a fire and settled in for what would become the longest night of his life. From the blackness beyond the firelight came noises, slow, deliberate movements, too calculated to be from any wild animal. Then came the voices. 3 of them, singing in perfect harmony, rising and falling like a mournful hymn. It was the same melody described in the old testimonies, the same song the jail guards had heard on the night before the execution. Ashford didn't sleep. He sat with his back against a tree feeding the flames, staring into the dark, waiting desperately for dawn. When morning came, he fled the mountain, moving faster than he ever had before, stumbling and sliding down the steep slopes. When his photographs were later developed, they showed nothing but overgrown ruins and tangled vegetation. Yet in several frames there were faint shapes, elongated shadows, blurred outlines, distortions that didn't match the light or landscape. Film defects, perhaps, or perhaps not. Ashford never published his findings. After his death in 1952, his notes, photographs, and journals were discovered sealed inside a box in his attic. Attached to the lid was a handwritten note. Some stories are not meant to be told. Some truths are better left unknown. Let the mountains keep their secrets. The materials were eventually donated to the university archives, where they remain stored and rarely examined, quietly gathering dust. But the story did not end there. Even now, more than a century and a half after the events of 1873, those who live in the high country of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia still speak of the Whitlock sisters. They still warn outsiders not to wander too deep into the northern ridges, and they still lower their voices when the wind begins to wail through the hollows. Park rangers report missing hikers who stray from the marked trails and are never seen again. Seasoned hunters vanish without a trace. And then there are the reports, always 3 figures, always identical women, watching silently from the tree line. They are said to wear old-fashioned clothes, standing motionless until they vanish the moment one looks away. Campers whisper about hearing soft singing drifting through the forest at night, songs in no known language. Photographs taken by tourists sometimes reveal faint figures in the background that no one remembers seeing when the shutter clicked. 3 shapes, always 3. Skeptics dismiss these tales as mountain superstition, folklore exaggerated by isolation and fear. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps the Whitlock sisters were nothing more than 3 deranged women whose crimes and deaths became embellished over time. Perhaps the rest is coincidence, patterns born of imagination and the human need to find meaning in the unknown. But those who live under the shadow of the Appalachians know better. They know there are places in this world where the veil between the natural and the supernatural wears thin, where ancient things linger older than civilization, older even than humankind. The earth remembers what was buried in it. The mountains hold secrets that are not meant to be disturbed, and so the legend endures. Martha, Clara, and June Whitlock, if those were truly their names, were only vessels, brief reflections of something much older, much darker, and infinitely patient. The mountain remembers. The mountain waits. The mountain always returns. Those words have echoed through generations, whispered by firelight and carried on the cold night winds. And on moonless nights, when the pine trees sway and the wind moans, through the valleys some say you can still hear it, the same song that haunted Pikeville so long ago. 3 voices perfectly joined, singing a melody older than words, a tune that will outlast the last of them. The Whitlock sisters were too terrible for history to preserve. Their story was erased, buried, and deliberately forgotten. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. In the ancient heart of the mountains, some things do not die. They wait. They remember. They endure. And if you followed this story to its end, perhaps you too will wonder, what else still waits in the shadows of the old mountains, where the earth hums with memory, and the night still sings with voices that were never human.